I'm going to introduce Melissa in a moment, but our topic for today has to do with immigration and migration and all these people around the world trying to come in our case, to the United States of America. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And what we're going to talk as well is how at this present moment, close to an election, how important it has become to deal with the issues of immigration and migration and illegal peoples coming in. And also I've asked Melissa if she would talk a little bit about this new policy of busing people, whether they like it or not, from the southern states up into the northern states, and cities such as Chicago and New York. So that will be on our agenda. I'm going to introduce Melissa, who is the Publications and Events Manager at the Center for Migration Studies on East 60th Street in New York. She is an attorney admitted to the New York State Bar who has extensive experience handling all types of immigration cases, including family-based petitions, waivers, asylum, naturalization, and employment-based petitions. Ms. Katsoris' initial degree was a BA in Economics and History from New York University in 2011. She went on to obtain her Doctor of Jurisprudence from Fordham University School of Law in 2015. Melissa is an active member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. She has held several internships with foreign and domestic governments, including the U.S. Court of International Trade, the High Court of Ireland, the New York City Council, and the Waterfront Commission of the New York Harbor. Prior to practicing immigration law, Ms. Katsoris was an advisor to the Permanent Mission of Greece at the United Nations, where she covered multiple topics, including migration. While advising on migration issues, she represented Greece during high-level negotiations leading up to the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration and Refugees. We have asked Melissa to talk about the serious migration issues at the southern border of the United States and the new trend to ship immigrants north to such destinations as New York City. Join me in welcoming Melissa Katsoris.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Don. So as Don said, I'm going to be discussing international migration. And before I start talking about the US border, I'd like to also give an overview of what's going on around the world and how other governments as well are managing the migration crises of our time. So I'm going to get started by sharing a PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of how refugee crises are influencing foreign policy around the world. So at the moment, migrants are typically leaving their homes due to war, political turmoil, economic crises, and opportunities to better their lives. And more recently, we've seen a lot of climate migrants who are leaving their homes because of climate situations such as hurricanes, droughts, etc. And geopolitics play a big role in where migrants wind up. So usually where wars or political turmoil are taking place can determine where migrants are coming from and where they're going. The countries involved will sometimes provide complementary pathways for people who are coming from countries where there are wars or political turmoil that they're involved in. And also neighboring countries wind up in the mix just because of their location. The economic conditions and poverty levels of countries of origin also influence where migrants are going. And natural disasters, as I said, are quickly becoming a driver for migration around the world. And also the countries that offer pathways to migrants typically um, are involved in the mix, where migrants will sometimes be motivated to go to those countries, or they'll be motivated just by the chance to make their lives better in that country. So usually mass migration often leads to agreements or domestic policies that will address these situations. These agreements usually involve humanitarian military aid, new border policies and closures, and complementary pathways, which are usually avenues of legal protection where refugees can go to places of safety or remain there legally. So before I get into discussions about the US, I'm going to go over some case studies of current and actually all of these migration crises are pretty current at the moment. So I'll start with Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and then Venezuela. So for Syria, the civil war there has caused mass migration to the European and MENA region. And I'm going to focus this discussion on the EU-Turkey deal. So after 11 years, Syria is still one of the largest refugee crises in the world, which is pretty significant. So the crisis began in 2011 when a violent government crackdown on public protests escalated into a civil war. And since then, there's been 6.8 million people forced to flee Syria. And there also remains 6.9 million that are displaced within the country. So I put a map here just to give a bit of a context of how geopolitics plays a role in this. So we have Syria here. A lot of the migrants are taking a route through Turkey in order to get to a final destination of Europe. Usually that is the goal for a lot of migrants, but a lot of migrants have also settled in Turkey and other areas in the Middle East or North Africa. So after the war started in 2011, violence in Syria started to get worse around 2015. And that's when a lot of us were seeing a lot of headlines about this crisis. So as the violence began and the government started targeting areas where the opposition forces were present, Syrians began fleeing the country and taking routes into neighboring countries like Turkey with the intention of going to Europe. So by 2015, almost 1 million refugees were arriving in the EU, and over 3,500 had died at sea because they were taking dangerous migration routes on rafts to cross the Mediterranean and Aegean seas from Turkey. And EU member states began closing their borders and becoming worried about migrants coming into their countries at around 2016. And Greece was one of the frontline states, of course, because of its geographical location, that a lot of migrants were coming in through Greece to get to other countries in the European Union. And Greece just started receiving an influx of migrants that they weren't really prepared for or could handle. So in March 2016, the EU-Turkey deal was implemented as a temporary measure to stop irregular migrants from coming to Turkey, coming from Turkey to the EU. And under the deal, Turkey agreed to take action to stop migrants from traveling irregularly to the Greek islands and allowed anyone who arrives on the islands to return back to Turkey. And as part of the deal, for every Syrian that was returned from the Greek islands, EU member states would accept one Syrian refugee who was waiting inside of Turkey. And in exchange, the EU gave Turkey €6 billion to provide humanitarian assistance to these refugees in Turkey and agreed to let Turkish nationals travel to the EU without a visa. So this was supposed to be a temporary measure, but it's been about 6 years. And technically this deal is still in place, but it isn't functioning the way it originally was intended to. So the EU-Turkey deal did significantly reduce the number of people making journeys to Greece. And about 2,000 people returned to Turkey from Greece under the deal. And 32,000 Syrian refugees were resettled from Turkey to the EU under the deal as well. But Turkey refused to receive refugees from Greece since March 2020 due to the pandemic. And this left thousands of asylum seekers and refugees on the Greek islands in limbo. And to make matters worse, in the spring, Turkey allowed thousands of migrants to pass through its territory to reach the Greek border. So the situation also was made worse when Greece issued a joint ministerial decision in June of 2022. And this decision designated Turkey as a safe third country for 5 nationalities, including Syria. And asylum applications from these nationals were deemed inadmissible because they were presumed to be safe to resettle in Turkey. And because Turkey hasn't been accepting migrants for about almost 3 years now, asylum seekers who were already in Greece and were deemed inadmissible are just stuck in Greece in legal limbo with no access to asylum or documents indicating their legal status. So a lot of these migrants who are already in Turkey can receive temporary protection to stay in Turkey temporarily until they find a more permanent solution. And there's over 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey right now. And Turkey is the largest host of refugees in the world. And Turkey, although they are housing a lot of refugees in their country, it is not holding up its non-refoulement obligations, which forbids a country from returning anyone to a country where they would be at risk of serious human rights violations. And this became relevant in May of this year when President Erdogan of Turkey announced that he was preparing a large-scale project to build homes for approximately 1 million Syrian refugees in parts of northern Syria that were secured by Turkish forces. And they've already built thousands of homes in this area and also infrastructure like schools and hospitals. But even though this seems like a solution for Syrians, the civil war is still ongoing there, and it's still not a very safe place for Syrians to be returning to. So there is a bit of debate as to whether this is holding up non-refoulement obligations. And so far, 800 Syrians have been sent back to Syria each week from Turkey. So my next case study will be about Ukraine and the Russian invasion, as well as the influx of Ukrainian refugees in Europe and the United States and their response to the crisis. So the Russian war began in February 2022 when Russian military invaded Ukraine. And since then, more than 7.7 million Ukrainians have fled the country to Europe. And there have been 14 million border crossings out of Ukraine, and 6.2 million people remain displaced in the country. And this invasion also caused a humanitarian crisis within the country with damaged infrastructure, and many civilians are lacking electricity, water, and access to food and basic supplies like shelter and emergency medical services. So I put this map here to give a better sense of where Ukrainian refugees are going. So as you can see, many are going to Poland. The vast majority of the 7.7 million, almost 7 million, are in Poland. And this is interesting because Poland is a neighboring country. It has a very similar culture to Ukraine. So it has been very welcoming, but it is a large amount of people to house in such a small country. And then we have Hungary and Romania over here. They are accepting a lot of Ukrainian refugees as well. And then we see that there's about 2.8 million that have gone to Russia. And this figure doesn't necessarily demonstrate a want to go to Russia. I think that there are a lot of people from Ukraine that are being forced to go to Russia at this moment. So as you could see, a lot of Ukrainian refugees are going to Europe. So the European Union had responses for immigration policy as well as military and humanitarian aid. So shortly after the war started in March 2022, the European Parliament redirected funds to support EU countries that were receiving Ukrainian refugees and allowed them to redeploy unused funds to manage the influx of refugees that were coming in and to give them humanitarian assistance. In June 2022, it also approved a 400 million euro support package to help EU countries receive these migrants. And in March 2022, the EU also activated a temporary protection directive that allowed Ukrainians to live, work, and access healthcare, housing, and education in EU countries for 3 years. And this mechanism was originally created after the Bosnian War to immediately offer legal status in EU countries to people fleeing war zones. And this use for Ukrainian refugees is the first time it's been used since the Bosnian War. And if the conflict continues, Ukrainians may be able to extend this status for another 2 years. So this is basically a temporary situation, but considering whether the war will last, it could last for several years. And as I mentioned before, Poland is the largest host country of Ukrainian refugees, and it's allowing Ukrainians to live and work there legally for 18 months. And it's also giving them access to the country's social welfare system, free healthcare, and public education, and gave them one-time payments to help cover their expenses. And Polish citizens have even been opening up their homes to them and hosting these refugees there. The United States has also been involved in the response. In March 2022, the Department of Homeland Security designated Ukraine for temporary protected status for 18 months. And TPS is a temporary solution for migrants to provide temporary protection against deportation and work authorization to nationals of designated countries that cannot return home due to armed conflict, environmental disaster, and other extraordinary conditions. But TPS is only a solution for people who are already in the United States when that country is designated for TPS. So if a Ukrainian national was not in the United States as of March 2022, they wouldn't have been eligible for TPS. Then after March, the Biden administration also put together some more permanent plans to help Ukrainians that are in Ukraine right now. So the Biden administration announced plans to accept up to 100,000 refugees from Ukraine in March through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And the Department of State also expanded U.S. RAP operations in Europe to provide Ukrainians with greater access to refugee resettlement processing through the Priority 2 Latinberg program. And this allows certain individuals legally residing in the United States to bring their family members here through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And also in April 2022, President Biden announced the Uniting for Ukraine program. And this is a streamlined process to provide humanitarian parole to Ukrainians. So humanitarian parole is basically a mechanism to allow Ukrainians in Ukraine to enter the United States. So, so the way that this program works is that individuals who have been residents in Ukraine as of February 11th, 2022, and have a sponsor in the US and complete vaccinations and other public health requirements, and also security checks could be eligible for this program. And those Ukrainians who passed this vetting process would be authorized to travel to the United States and be considered for parole here for up to 2 years. And this would protect them from deportation, allow them to live and work in the United States for a temporary period of time. The UK also created schemes for Ukrainians in particular. The UK provided the Ukrainian Family Scheme that allows Ukrainians who have family members with British citizenship to come to the UK to live, work, and study and have access to public funds. The UK also launched the Homes for Ukraine program in March 2022 that allows UK citizens to host Ukrainian refugees who they know in their homes. And they basically are offering a rent-free space to these Ukrainians for at least 6 months in exchange for a government subsidy. And the Ukraine extension scheme was also offered, which allows Ukrainians or close family members of Ukrainians to live, work, and study in the UK if they were given permission to previously enter the country between March 2022 and May 2023, or previously received permission that expired in January of 2022. So these examples that I just showed you are pretty much showing how a lot of the world views the situation as Ukraine as temporary. So the global response has been reflective in that way, where as we saw, a lot of the immigration solutions that were offered to Ukrainians in the EU, UK, and the US offered temporary protection for them to come to those countries until the war is over. And some Ukrainian children have even been attending school online as an all Ukrainian school that are conducting classes in Ukrainian. And this is done in an effort to make the transition smooth when they go back to Ukraine. And the Ukrainian government and the European Commission are also co-leading an international coordination platform called the Ukrainian Reconstruction Platform to build Ukraine after the war. So up next is Afghanistan, which is more relevant to the US. And I'm going to go over the complementary pathways that were offered to Afghan refugees after the war was over. So in August 2021, President Joe Biden announced that the 20-year war in Afghanistan was ending, and this was the longest war in American history. And by the end of August, the US completed one of the biggest airlifts to date, evacuating more than 120,000 people out of Afghanistan, including US citizens and permanent residents, as well as Afghans. And within 2 weeks from then, approximately 64,000 Afghans were evacuated to the United States. And the United States and 97 other countries also issued a joint statement that basically pledged their commitment to allow Afghan refugees to travel to their countries and tried to secure an agreement with the Taliban to allow safe passage for them to their countries. Currently, there's 2.6 million registered Afghan refugees in the world, and there's 3.5 million who are internally displaced in the country right now. So after this war, the Biden administration issued a lot of different pathway programs for Afghan refugees. In August 2021, President Biden directed the Department of Homeland Security to lead an interagency task force called Operation Allies Welcome. And this was an ongoing domestic initiative to resettle vulnerable Afghans to the United States. And this program basically brought Afghan refugees to the United States on military planes and housed them at military bases, and eventually connected them to resettlement organizations for placement into communities in the United States. In addition to that, the US also had been offering special immigrant visas to Afghans who were employed by the US government for at least 2 years. And they were able to apply for this visa in Afghanistan or in the United States if they were brought here via Operation Allies Welcome through a parole program, similar to the program I just described for Ukrainians, where basically allows Afghans to come into the United States. And this visa did apply to a lot of Afghans that were coming in during the airlift, and it still applies to a lot of Afghans that are still there, who are facing a serious threat based on their employment with the United States over the 20-year war. In August 2021, the Department of State also offered Afghans P2 designation, granting them access to the US Refugee Admissions Program. And the Department of Homeland Security also designated Afghanistan for temporary protected status for 18 months from May 20th, 2022 through November 20th, 2023. And the US also recently announced a long-term plan for resettling Afghans. So far, the US has welcomed 76,000 Afghans through Operation Allies Welcome. And in September, the Biden administration announced that it'll refocus its efforts and resettle Afghans in the US through a long-term program called Operation Enduring Welcome. And this program hopes to resettle Afghans through existing immigration pathways that I just described that lead to lawful permanent residence in the US. And this this program is focused more on resettling Afghans permanently in the United States instead of offering humanitarian parole to enter temporarily, as the situation in Afghanistan is obviously more permanent. And starting October 1st, under the Operation Enduring Welcome program, the Biden administration started resettling Afghans that fall into other categories that weren't really covered by some of these programs, like the special immigrant visa or the P2 program. And and the categories were family members of US citizens, lawful permanent residents, and Afghans that were already brought to the United States, Afghans who are eligible for some of these visas, and those who received priority referrals for the US Refugee Admissions Program. So my last case study that is actually more relevant to the US and the situation and the political situation in the US right now is Venezuela. And I'm going to just talk about the background of Venezuela and how Venezuelan refugees eventually got caught up into immigration politics and were flown to Martha's Vineyard. So just to give a little bit of background, Venezuela actually used to be the host of a lot of refugees in South America and other parts of the world. But most recently, due to political turmoil, violence, lack of food and medicine and essential services, and also a crumbling infrastructure, Venezuelans have been leaving their country in droves, and more than 7 million people have left Venezuela so far, with no signs of the displacement crisis slowing. And many Venezuelans blame President Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, for the country's decline. During Maduro's first term at the beginning of 2013, after Chavez's death, Venezuela experienced an economic collapse that resulted in hyperinflation and shortages of essential resources such as water, fuel, and medicine, and frequent power outages, and a crumbling infrastructure that led to social unrest. And currently, there are also 7 million Venezuelans that are in need of humanitarian assistance there, and there's no signs of economic improvement. The political situation in Venezuela is also interesting because currently the government of President Nicolas Maduro and the opposition party are experiencing a power struggle. So in 2019, the opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself the acting president after Maduro was sworn into his second 6-year term in the office. But there was a lot of controversy surrounding that election, as many candidates were either barred from running, jailed, or fled the country out of fear of being imprisoned. And although 50 countries recognize Guaido as the legitimate president, including the United States, the Venezuelan military and governing bodies have mostly remained loyal to Maduro. So where are Venezuelans going? I put a map here to give a bit of a context of the geography of the situation. So right now, the largest host of Venezuelan migrants is neighboring Colombia. And Colombia is housing about 2.4 million Venezuelan refugees. But even though Colombia has been very welcoming to Venezuelans, more and more are starting to embark on dangerous journeys through Central America and Mexico to reach the US border. So as you could see, Venezuelans can migrate into Colombia and go through this route through Panama to head towards Mexico and eventually to the United States border. So Colombia does offer a lot of pathways for Venezuelans to settle there. And they're offered a temporary protection program there where they receive legal residence, work authorization, healthcare, and pathways to permanent residence there. But Colombia is also facing economic uncertainty and the highest level of inflation in more than 2 decades. So a lot of Venezuelans that are going there don't have a lot of economic opportunities and are considering Colombia as a destination of transit instead of their final destination. And many are going further north to the United States for economic opportunities. And this brings me to the Darien Gap, which is an important factor in this. So this is probably one of the most dangerous migration routes in the world. And the Darien Gap is basically a roadless jungle between Colombia and Panama. And it's the only gap in the Pan American Highway between Alaska and Argentina. And it has a lot of mountains, swamps, dense jungle, and it's very hostile. So hostile that it's almost impossible to put infrastructure there. And the area is really just not policed. But it is the only way for migrants to get between South America and Central America, and eventually leading up to Mexico and the United States. So in order to get through the gap between South and Central America, migrants have no choice to make a dangerous trek for 60 miles on foot. And a lot of people die along the way because of the conditions. And there's also a lot of paramilitary groups and criminal gangs in this area because of the lack of police and lack of infrastructure there. So more than 151,000 migrants have crossed the Darien Gap en route to the United States between January and September of 2022. And nearly 20,000 of them were children making this brutal journey. And between January 2021 and August 2022, US officials detained over 200,000 Venezuelans who were caught crossing the US-Mexico border irregularly. And Venezuelans who crossed the border and were admitted to the United States after they were caught wound up in the crosshairs of anti-immigration politics in the US, unfortunately. And they were among some of the migrants who were being bused and flown from Texas and Arizona to more liberal sanctuary cities in the north, like New York, DC, and Chicago. And this was done by the governors of Texas and Arizona. And they spent millions of dollars to charter these buses in an effort to protest the Biden administration's more welcoming immigration policies and the increasing number of arrivals at the US-Mexico border. And most recently, one of the more controversial acts of sending migrants up north was when Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida had sent 50 Venezuelans on a plane from Texas to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts in September 2022. And so after this happened, there was a lot of questions around it. And one of the main questions was whether these Venezuelans were brought to Martha's Vineyard under false pretenses. And there was a lot of evidence that they were. Most of them had said that they were approached by a woman who was offering them brochures and services in Martha's Vineyard, or I think a lot of them even said that she didn't mention that they were going to Martha's Vineyard and just offered aid. And Texas Sheriff Javier Salazar also certified this group of migrants that were flown to Martha's Vineyard as victims of a crime, which was very interesting because after he submitted certification documents for them and certified them as victims, these migrants were actually given a different pathway to permanent residence in the US through a U visa, which grants victims of crimes temporary visas to stay in the United States and eventually could offer them a pathway to permanent residence in the US. So it was an interesting turn of events because this Ron DeSantis's act of flying these migrants in a pretty sloppy way and in a way that wasn't necessarily legal, it actually gave them a new pathway to remain in the United States permanently. And And investigations are showing that they were given false information about where they were going and the support they were going to receive. And Sheriff Salazar stressed that this could be a possible case of unlawful restraint. And on October 12th, the Department of Treasury announced that it will investigate DeSantis's use of COVID-19 relief money and whether he can fund migrant transportation with these funds or any interest earned on them. And these migrants also filed a class action lawsuit against him, alleging fraud and misrepresentation. So these recent cases have been interesting because considering that we have midterm elections coming up, it does seem like a political stunt to just garner some attention onto the immigration situation in the United States and to spread anti-immigrant rhetoric. But what's interesting is that a lot of these migrants that are coming up north are receiving more aid from these states, and they also have access to more pro bono legal services for their cases because a lot of them had crossed the border illegally, but they also have dates in court. So they would eventually go to court in these jurisdictions that are a little bit more friendly to migrants. And some argue that this could actually benefit their cases going forward because they have more access to charity, shelter, and a lot of other legal services that they may not get towards the border, and they may have a higher quality of life. So it's definitely an interesting and ongoing case right now in the US. So since I've been talking for a while, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So I forgot to mention for Venezuelans, so a lot of this political turmoil has also led to different parole programs for Venezuelans as well. And right after the situation in Martha's Vineyard, the Biden administration announced that it was also implementing a new parole program for Venezuelans to enter the US. And this program is pretty similar to the parole programs that were offered to Afghans and Ukrainians. And it basically allows them to come to the United States from Venezuela instead of them making that dangerous trek up to the US-Mexico border. And this is kind of reflected in the requirements of the program, and Venezuelans who enter the US, Mexico, or Panama regularly wouldn't qualify for it. And it's also a little bit controversial though, because under the agreement, the United States and Mexico coordinated enforcement efforts, and Mexico agreed to start accepting Venezuelan migrants under Title 42. And this was a measure that the Trump administration had invoked in March of 2020 at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a section of the Public Health and Safety Act that allows the US government to temporarily block non-citizens from entering the United States in the interest of public health. And previously, Venezuelans were not subject to Title 42, but with this new development, they are now. So there has been a lot of controversy around this, and a lot of immigration advocates don't agree with this new development. Okay, so
Thank you. You in many ways took over my role, because I was so pleased that you went to these other countries, such as Ukraine and Syria, and told us a little bit about why these people want to leave their countries, and many of them want to come our way. And I was thinking more along the lines of, looking at our own belly buttons within the country of the United States. But what you did, as I say, was a real plus to tell us why these things are going on. You have also, at the end of your remarks, dealt with this issue about the drop off in Venezuelans crossing into the United States in the last week or two because of this change that Biden made in the laws of sending people back according to health requirements and not other things that the government can think of. And on this subject of yours, immigration and migration, is so important that pages on the weekend newspaper here, the New York Times, are on the plight of cities on this side of the border. And this particular one was the story of El Paso and all the people coming into its jurisdictions, and our cities the way to go in terms of looking after all of these people who are coming. In the case of Canada, where I know a little bit about, the government decided that we would accept 20,000 Syrians, but the government insisted that there be a home for them when they came to Canada. By that it meant that church groups and other social groups were expected to apply to the government to house and welcome these people. And that worked quite well, except when the numbers got greater and the volunteers sort of got overcome by the numbers. But it was a way that people knew that they would be welcomed at the receiving end of this trip of theirs. And I wondered, looking back through the 4 countries that you dealt with, whether or not governments in the United States made similar kind of arrangements to where to welcome these people once they got here. And I don't know much about that, so I wonder if you could help us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depended on where they wound up. So at the US border, there are services that help migrants, and there's a lot of nonprofits along the border that their main mission is to help migrants who are crossing the border, who have nothing, who don't have shelter or food or any family to help them. And also with these new, basically new tactics of busing migrants to northern areas. A lot of governments in New York, DC, and Chicago, for example, are rising to the occasion, and a lot of them have declared a state of emergency and are putting together emergency shelter, and the communities in the areas are a little more welcoming. So they're volunteering to provide food, water, shelter, clothes. And yeah, there is, so it kind of depends on which state you're in, and also how many nonprofits are around. And as far as the federal government and organized effort, there is some services. So at the US border, if you are caught, technically you could either be released or you could be detained. So the US government doesn't provide too much of a service to these people. It's basically saying, you're on your own and here's your court date and you can come to court soon.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's a kind of devil may care for you or whatever. I wonder if our listeners know how many immigrants there are in this country. The State Department does publish the fact that 14% of the present US population are immigrants, and immigrants plus US-born children represent 1/4 of the total number of people within the United States of America. Of the total of, again, 1/4 come from Mexico. So Mexico has the largest number of immigrants in the United States. And another figure that the State Department puts out is that 2/3 of undocumented immigrants have lived in the United States for more than 10 years. And so many of them are slipping through whatever court dates or other things that they're expected to show up for. without too much penalty, it would seem from that last statistic. So when you help people come into the country as an immigration lawyer, are they usually sponsored people? Because what was being said in the newspapers was that a goodly portion of the people that come into the country have relatives here already because they have a history of coming in over the years. And so they then can have a home somewhere and the government will help them get there. But normally the people that you deal with, are they, do they have a sponsor?
Well, it really depends. So the people that you're talking about who have been in the United States for years, undocumented, they don't have a lot of options. Usually they'll eventually have an option through a family member. So if they come to the United States, they've had a family here, they have had children, their children can eventually apply for them to get green cards through their relationship. And then there are people who are coming for employment-based benefits, and usually these people are coming more recently. So to qualify for employment-based benefits, you need to you cannot have any unlawful presence in the United States. So that kind of weeds out the system for sponsorship. So the only way that you can possibly get an employment-based benefit is if you had come to the United States and had already applied for an employment-based benefit, such as like an H-1B, an O visa, TN, etc. There's a lot of different options for employment-based depending on the type of work that you do or the countries that you're coming from. And a lot of the time, people will begin these processes either in their country of origin or if they're here legally. So if you're here as a student, for example, you have a lot more time while you are a student to find an employer that will sponsor you. And also you can work under a student visa via OPT or CPT programs that allow you to work for about a year in the US after you graduate.
I see.
So those are usually the people that are coming through employment-based. And then most of the people who have been here undocumented for a long time, they mainly have access to either a humanitarian solution like asylum or a family-based benefit. And for family-based benefits, if you've been here for years without status, that's okay. You can still get your green card. And it's the same for humanitarian benefits. So the only things that could hold these people back for that is if they cross the border illegally. That's definitely a challenge that you could overcome with a waiver application, or there are other things that could prevent you, such as crimes of moral turpitude. If you've been convicted of certain crimes, you can't get these green cards. But yeah, those are the typical situations I would encounter practicing immigration law.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a number of questions on our Q&A board.
Yeah.
And one of them there, the second one from the top, is from Nancy Josephine Cameron. Do you know what's happening with the children who were separated from their parents and were held by the government apart?
Yeah, so the Biden administration had set up a task force for those people who were separated during the Trump administration. And I'm not sure on the figures, but so far they have reunited a lot of families, which is great because a lot of the parents of these children were deported back to like Central America or Mexico, and it's hard to track where they went and where they are. So there has been some success with that, but there's also still a lot of children that still are kind of in limbo in that situation.
Yeah. And another question from Stanley Amberg. Please explain the difference between an asylum seeker and an economic migrant. Please explain how current U.S. law treats asylum seekers versus migrants. That's an interesting question.
So US law doesn't really designate an economic migrant. So
It does
if
not.
you refer to an economic migrant, I would say you're probably referring to someone who's coming
Ah,
here on an employment-based visa, or you could even consider somebody who's motivated to come to the US to, I guess, live a better life as an economic migrant. And an asylum seeker is someone who is fleeing their country due to multiple types of persecution, including political persecution, religious, sexual orientation. And the bar is a bit higher for asylum seekers because you need to prove that you were experiencing this persecution, which can be pretty hard, and it's a longer process.
thank you. Thank you. What status of immigration administration judges legal effort to handle refugee cases? I don't understand that question. Maybe you do. What status?
I guess that could be asking whether immigration judges are, I guess, making an effort to handle refugee cases. So, so immigration judges don't handle refugee cases. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program of the Department of State are the ones that handle refugee cases. So the way that the U.S. accepts refugees is that they actually apply for the program in their countries, and they're brought to the United States through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And once they get here, they're provided with resources to resettle into certain communities in the United States. So there's a bit of a difference between people who are coming through that program or people who are just coming in on their own.
Oh, thank you. We're both being given a little bit of information here from Edward Russell, Peter, we know him. Regarding Dawn's question about U.S. welcoming programs, are you aware of the dozen or so community welcoming groups in Westchester County who have helped settle over 100 families in recent years? Examples are Open Arms for Refugees and Hearts and Homes for Refugees. They work with the overseeing groups such as HIAS and Catholic Charities. So I learned something just now. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and those are the groups that work with the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program to help resettle them.
You already know many things which I don't. The other thing that was high in the news for a while and seems to have disappeared is this DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it seems to have gone off the map, as it were. And did it get resolved? Is that what happened?
No, so right now, so it is still being litigated in court. So right now, people who qualify for the DACA program cannot submit like an initial application for protection. So the only people that can apply are people who already have DACA and are renewing their status at the moment. And the issue is still being litigated in a district court in Texas. And this actually is in recent news because last week the Court of Appeals had basically sent this case back to the U.S. District Court in Texas. And right now, so the Biden administration is trying to codify the DACA program, but because of these court challenges, they've been experiencing a lot of obstacles. So the federal government's most recent attempt to codify the program was supposed to take effect on October 31st. And right now, that's on pause because of these legal challenges. So it is kind of up in the air whether the program will continue the way it is, or if it will eventually be decided that the program can open it up again to initial applicants. And there have also been a lot of bills to try to give DACA recipients a permanent road to permanent residence. So they none of these bills have passed though, which is kind of disheartening. And there is a huge population of people who were brought to the United States as children and are basically only receiving protection against deportation and work authorization through the DACA program.
So it's in limbo, as it were.
Yeah, and it's been in limbo for a long time.
And may stay there for a while. One of the issues that we see is this idea of sending people back to the dangerous countries where they have escaped from or tried to. And America has, over the years and at different times, spent a lot of money trying to bring economic changes to some of these middle America countries to keep the people at home. And I don't know if there are organizations, political ones, working on that side of that is the foreign affairs, foreign aid, foreign support to a lot of these countries, which would get rid of the problems of danger. And the one we're looking at more closely now, of course, is Haiti, where gangs have physically taken over the country, it seems. So what can be done from your perspective? What could be done to make life more agreeable for these people that they would stay home?
Well, in those situations, time will tell. So there have been efforts, even by the US government, to make conditions in certain countries better so that people aren't compelled to make these dangerous journeys up to the United States. But sometimes, I mean, you can give these countries money, try to provide some infrastructure, but it would take time for those countries to really see the effects of that aid. And also, a lot of the time, you know, if there's political turmoil or if there's violence going on in countries, it's hard for foreign governments to stop that without creating a military interference. And it seems the US is trying to not take that stance more recently, where we, instead of going into a country with our military, we're trying to provide economic aid to make things better. But a lot of these efforts have been pretty recent, and it's hard to say whether they're going to work and whether people eventually would stop migrating and feel more economically secure in their countries. But at the moment, for example, in Haiti, the situation is pretty dangerous, and it would probably take time for the situation to get better enough to stop people from leaving.
One questioner, Nancy Cameron, is asking us to compare the welcoming of the United States as other countries. In the case of welcoming Syrians and Ukrainians and Afghanistan people, how are we doing in comparison?
These case studies are pretty interesting because of the political aspects of them, and even just the relations the United States has with some of these countries. The welcome for certain groups is better than others, and we've seen with the Ukrainians, for example, that the U.S. Immediately created programs for them to come here and immediately gave aid. And it was actually a similar reaction in Europe, where there was a lot more of a welcoming attitude towards Ukrainians than there was previously to the Syrians who were coming just a few years before. So I think the welcome that a lot of these refugees receive is sometimes dependent on those factors, whether, you know, the group is similar culturally, or the politics between those countries. So I'm not I think statistically, it depends on, I guess, the location as well. For example, with Ukraine and Syria, obviously, Europe is closer to Ukraine and Syria. So it saw a greater number of people coming from those countries there as opposed to coming to the US because it's just easier to get to.
Yes, and of course, I think your number was somewhere around 7 million
Mhm.
coming across the border into Poland, for example.
Yeah.
In the case of Lebanon, they now say that there are more people huddling within Lebanon than there were citizens to start with. So in some cases, the numbers can certainly get larger than the people that are already living there. How can these countries take in 7 million people? It's amazing to me.
Yeah, and it's something that may not be sustainable because a lot of the neighboring countries don't have the infrastructure to handle that many people. And of course, their citizens are more welcoming usually in the beginning of the crisis, and then sometimes the welcome grows tired.
Yeah. Joan, are you there? Where is she gone? We're getting
No,
towards
I'm here.
we're getting towards the end of our
Yes,
delightful
we are. It's wonderful.
presentation today.
I
Melissa, again, I have to say to you that you came so well prepared, so
right.
easy to follow along with and understand that I just want to single you out for those facts.
Right.
Plus, the information you gave us is first rate with lots of good things in there that we will take with us as we go along our day to day and into the future. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your enthusiasm of agreeing to come and participate with us. And what more can I say?
No, there's not much.
It's been a pleasure.
It's wonderful. So it was so easy to understand. The whole
Yeah.
PowerPoint was a wonderful idea. Thank you so much for that.
Of course.
As
Thanks for
Don
having
said,
me.
you were so well prepared. And I'm sure the audience here appreciates that. Thank you again for coming. And Don, you always amaze me how you find people. It's unbelievable.
We get good people.
And always you pick excellent people, excellent speakers in topics that are relevant and current. So that's what we really need. Thank you very much. So I want to thank both of you again.
Thank you, Melissa.
And
Thank
just-
you.
and remind people that next time it'll be on November 7th. We are having Professor from Columbia, Tim Frey, who will be discussing Russia's inner workings and how Putin keeps control. So that would be November 7th. I hope you register for that program. And I hope you all have a good day. And again, thanks to Don and Melissa. So again, have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.